Greetings everyone! This video lecture covers Hick Chapter 2, which is the emergence and decline of the welfare state with a focus on the history of social welfare in Canada. So this PowerPoint will give you a chance to have a look at some information about the historical elements that have come together to create our contemporary social welfare state in Canada. Sometimes students ask why it's important to include history in any chapter where we introduce a new concept. And I think you'll come to see by the time you finish watching these slides that the ancient has a role to play in the contemporary realities. And many of the things that were introduced during the British Poor Law era, remain important concepts present in social welfare today. Here I am. Here's a picture of me so you know who's lecturing. To give you an overview of what's covered in this PowerPoint presentation, it's important to remember that Canada was a colony of the British Empire, and prior to that of the French Empire. And so this colonial history, particularly the British colonial history, shapes a lot of the social welfare practices that we engage in today. In particular, the concepts of deserving and undeserving poor, introduced during the era of the British Poor Law, remain fundamental elements of our social welfare system. And these concepts are associated with social welfare practices that could be and can be demeaning, and that are often based on a system of punishment or a form of moral re-education for people who are using the social welfare system. We also know that in a contemporary context, this idea of punishment and moral re-education has been further ingrained through neoliberalism, and that this kind of approach to social welfare introduces what some scholars have referred to as a third wave approach to social welfare, and if you want to know more about that, you could read Bob Mullally's work. And that this third wave approach really reflects a kind of attitude of tough love from the state, in which the state is understood as a benevolent parent that is supposed to create an independent citizen. And that when people don't learn to be independent through the opportunities that are provided to them generally in society, for example through education, tough love from the state is necessary in order to create an independent citizen. Our consideration of social welfare in Canada really begins when capitalism becomes an important part of the way economies work in the British Empire, and to a lesser degree in the European countries as well. So the decline of feudalism and the relations that were embedded in feudalism meant that there was a movement towards capitalism. And under feudal systems, landholders had some responsibility for the peasants that worked their lands. So land was not really a formal system of private property. It was a system of divine entrustment in which landowners who were seen to be closer to godly because they were upper class people were understood also to have an entrustment of the people who worked their land. But as enclosure and private property understandings became more prominent in Europe, this relationship between the peasants that worked the land and the owners of the land was weakened. And so, under capitalism, significant changes meant a change in the understanding of who was responsible for people when they experienced difficulties like poverty. Hick's text doesn't speak much about some of the more sinister aspects of the end of feudalism. For example, forced land clearance, the burning or knocking down of peasant houses, and the enclosure of grazing lands where people who kept sheep used to graze their sheep in order to produce wool and meat. The transition from feudal systems to capitalist systems were violent, and they resulted in lots of death and harm to people. But Hick does tell us about the idea that workers became free workers, or peasants became free workers who could sell their labor, and that factories and technologies created new opportunities for workers to sell their labor And that part of this was facilitated by things like money and systems of storing wealth rather than systems of barter where people exchanged goods in order to meet their needs. This also created modern concepts of the family, gender-based work roles, and childhood. So folks studying social work and psychology ought to be quite concerned with capitalism, as it introduced many of the concepts that we concern ourselves with. Colonization can also be understood as an early form of globalization, which we'll talk about later in the course. So, when the British and the French, to a lesser degree, conquered lands and extracted wealth from those lands, it had a negative effect on the people who lived on those lands. And so in a Canadian context, we're concerned about Indigenous or Aboriginal people and the effect that colonization and capitalism had on them and still have on them today. There's a little typo in the slide. The apostrophe S shouldn't be there. It should just be Aboriginal peoples. We also know that the rise of capitalism necessitated the creation of both public and private welfare systems, sometimes developed out of a kind of benevolence and sometimes developed out of a kind of need. And so we'll have a look at these as we move forward. In the last lecture, I mentioned the fact that we can understand social welfare as in part about legislation, policies, and texts that speak to what it is we do as social workers or as people providing social welfare resources and services. And so the Statute of Laborers is one of the early documents that we understand as a foundation for the contemporary Canadian welfare state. The Statute of Laborers was really created out of a necessity when the Black Death or the bubonic plague struck in Europe, particularly in England. Significant illness and death, quarantine, and other steps taken by government to try to control disease meant that people were very poor. And so begging or living off the land became necessary in order for survival. And this meant that labor shortages ensued as people died in large numbers, as people became ill in large numbers, as people lived off the land. There were not workers to work in the garment and weaving industries that had been established in Britain. And so laws were passed in order to make begging illegal and to force people to take the jobs that were available, whether or not these jobs were desirable or met their needs. This document really set out a system of belief about people who require support or who experience poverty or other needs that they cannot meet themselves. These attitudes still echo in today's contemporary social welfare system. So 4 key concepts outlined in the Statute of Laborers related to beliefs about people who beg. So basically the legislation or the law speaks to the idea that people who can live without working won't work. They will remain idle. And so beggars, who were believed to make a substantial living from begging, were not allowed to beg. There were systems put in place to compel them to work and to work at whatever work was available. There was also a belief that people who were not engaged in work were more inclined towards things like crime or engaging in vice, so drinking or gambling or other kinds of activity not seen to be moral. And so people who gave charity or provided resources to people who were begging were seen as part of the problem, as they were enabling these beggars to meet their needs without engaging in paid work. And so, as I mentioned, we still maintain these kinds of beliefs today. The Statute of Laborers helped to create some terms or concepts that we use to understand people who are using assistance, and these remain in use today. So, for example, the concept of deserving poor is assigned to people who cannot work and who require assistance for a reason that is understood to be legitimate by the state. Undeserving poor are people who are understood to lack some kind of motivation or to have some kind of moral failing. They don't deserve support from the state, but rather require some kind of re-education in order to become fruitful, independent citizens. It's necessary to conduct some kind of an assessment in order to determine which kind of person is requesting assistance, whether it's someone deserving or undeserving. And in contemporary social work practice, a lot of the work that social workers do is completing these kinds of assessments to determine whether or not people are eligible to receive services, and if so, what level of service they should receive. As the British Poor Law evolved, more complex understandings of assessing deserving and undeserving people emerged. So, for example, we could talk about the able-bodied poor who were not deemed to be eligible to receive assistance, or the aged who were seen as eligible to receive assistance, or disabled poor people who were eligible to receive some forms of assistance. Able-bodied poor people under the British Poor Law system were compelled to work. They received physical punishment if they would not work. Disabled people were given permits to beg, and you could give charity to people who were the sanctioned poor without fear of reprisal from the state. The British Poor Law established institutional responses to issues like poverty. For example, children who were orphaned or who lived in extreme poverty could be placed in the care of local families who were crafts or tradespeople or who owned factories. This often meant that the children lived on the grounds of factories and actually received very little parenting or care. They were forced to work long hours in order to pay off the debt associated with their room and board. Children who were indentured to local families or factory owners were forced to work for several years for these families until they reached either the age of 18 or 21, depending upon the arrangement. And after that time, the children could then sell their labor. The distinction between able-bodied employable and unemployable people was formalized, and hospitals and almshouses were created where people could receive relief and services through particular institutions, depending upon whether or not they were deemed to be ill or whether they were deemed to be able-bodied. Committal to an almshouse still required work, but this work was really about sustaining the almshouse as opposed to contributing to the economy as a workhouse might. Hospitals, which might sound like a benevolent kind of treatment of people who were ill or disabled in some way, were really seen as a death sentence because the practices of medicine during this era were quite, shall we say, rustic and lacked really comprehensive scientific understandings of things like infection prevention. And so people who ended up in hospital often caught illnesses that were more serious than those that they actually attended hospital with. Finally, the British Poor Law established very specific relationships between parent and children, placing parents under the responsibility of children when children were grown, and placing children under the responsibility of parents long after they'd grown. So parents and children were responsible for the care of one another when either the child or the parent experienced a situation of poverty or unemployment. In this way, the state could return a person to their parent's home or bring a parent to a child's home and force them to provide resources and supports to that person. The early British Poor Law also established the principle of lesser eligibility. Lesser eligibility was an understanding that any kind of assistance provided to people by the state had to be lower than the lowest wage they could earn in the market economy. This was seen as a way of deterring people from seeking public assistance or support, because it was impossible to make the same as or more than one would make at work. Outdoor relief was also established, and this provided a place of residence for people to receive particular kinds of resources and supports. Again, institutionalizing the provision of charity to people in need. Outdoor relief was frequently provided in workhouses. Generally speaking, men were placed in workhouses, and in these sites they were forced to do hard labor kind of work. And this work performed within the workhouse could be used to benefit the market economy. So products or resources created within the workhouses could be sold for profit. The idea behind the workhouse was that it was meant to teach discipline, to re-educate someone around the importance of disciplined work, and to reorient their morality to seeing work as something that was good and productive. It also potentially provided particular skills to people who might not have skills that were marketable. Women's eligibility to receive resources within workhouses was tied to their relationship to men. Widows could receive relief and were understood to be deserving poor, whereas unmarried women with children were seen to be undeserving because they were morally tainted as they had engaged in sexual activity outside of marriage. In some instances, workhouses provided support to married couples. Discipline, punishment, and training are three concepts that are important to the early poor law era. People needed to be disciplined and engage in work. People who were not disciplined and did not engage in work were punished. And training might be something that was provided to people in order to facilitate a return to work. We might understand this kind of training as what we talk about today as workfare, in that people engaged in work in order to learn a particular skill. Selling labor in the market economy was seen as a kind of freedom, and people who elected not to exercise this freedom could lose that freedom by being indentured or placed in a workhouse, poorhouse, or hospital. Charity was really seen as a problem in that it was believed to create a kind of dependence among people who experienced poverty. Complaints about spending on poor relief sparked a review of the British Poor Law in 1834. The plan during this review was to cut relief rates and enforce a number of drastic reforms. We might see this era of British Poor Law as similar to Ontario's Mike Harris era. The increase of the population as well as urbanization resulting from industrialization created a kind of concentration of poor people in particular areas, thus drawing attention to the issue of poor law. This law really introduced what we might refer to as bootstrap thinking, or the idea that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do whatever it is that they need to do in order to get out of poverty. This kind of approach really blames the victim and doesn't take into account some of the contextual issues that affect people's capacity to engage in work or to obtain and maintain work. These reforms further ingrained the idea of deserving and undeserving poor, and it really created a punitive system in which people could be forced to work. The idea of lesser eligibility continued to be an important part of the system, and a kind of stigmatization of poor people was also further ingrained in order to make the cost of being poor something that was borne not only in terms of the physical self, but also in terms of one's social standing in the community. Resources and supports provided to people really reflected a bare subsistence kind of understanding, and an adequate standard of living was seen as something that was a luxury for people who engaged in paid work. Means and needs tests were still used to assess people's eligibility for receiving supports. The fact that someone was in need was seen as less important than the cause of that need. And so your treatment or the kinds of resources that you received were really dependent upon understandings of the cause of your need. And stigma of failure was something that was used to socially control the population. So this short lecture gives you an overview of the significance of the British Poor Law in creating a foundation for today's contemporary social work and social welfare practices in Canada. I realize that this material can be a little bit dry, however, it is important, and you'll note that there are a number of supplemental resources available for you on Blackboard, and I hope you'll take advantage of those.